Welcome. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm so sorry. We have some feedback. Okay. Welcome. Okay. Hello. Hello. Welcome, everyone. This is the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University, and we are doing our weekly Friday seminar. I am Alberto Diaz-Calleros, the director, and today for those of you who might be joining us through YouTube on the live stream, I just want to let you know that we will have this live stream available even after the event itself ends. Please submit any questions you might have on the comments part of the YouTube chat for Professor Romero after I will be able to ask your questions after his presentation. I do want to remind us all that here at Stanford, we're in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer the gratitude to the land, to the water, the air that surround us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone and the Lenape peoples who continue to be present in their homelands throughout their diasporas. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Today's talk, the title is Security and Illegality in Cuba's Transition to Democracy, Violence in the Hispanic and Lusophone Worlds. And this is actually going to be a book presentation, a book that has just been published by Professor Vidal Romero at ITAM. Vidal Romero is a professor at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. He co-directs the Center for the Study of Security, Intelligence, and Governance there at ITAM. He has been a fellow at the London School of Economics, and he also was a Tinker visiting professor here at Stanford University. His Ph.D. is actually from Stanford, and he has written variously about different issues related to presidential approval, public opinion. He's one of the prime experts on public opinion in Mexico, but he also has a very strong interest in questions about political conflict, violence, and security in the region. So today he's going to be talking to us of a very different project that he embarked on, I think, even before the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken, which includes a lot of field work in Cuba. So Vidal, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Alberto. And thanks so much to Elizabeth and Megan and Sarah for putting all this together. Yes, as Alberto told you, this book is part of a wider project that has to do with trying to understand what's going on in Cuba in terms of security and illegality. And actually it started, well, thinking about the project in 2015. So it's like 6 years ago. And I was lucky enough to get some support from the National Endowment for Democracy to embark on this project, which I will drive you through it. But it was really challenging for me, basically because I was trying to do research on an authoritarian regime, such as Cuba. So the conditions are not optimal to work on this, especially in the field. But you have to work in the field when you do research on Cuba, because there's not much available data. There is some economic data, likely because they are being pressured by international organizations, but there's almost no data regarding security. For instance, there's no official data on day-to-day crimes like robbery, assault, fraud, and the like. There is literally no data. So you got to do research in field. But if you want to go to Cuba and to do research, you have to ask, to many countries, you have to ask for a specific visa that allows you to do that. Obviously, if they don't like you or your project, they won't issue the visa. So you gotta figure out how to balance the ethics of of research and how to balance an efficient way to gather data, and most importantly, do not put anyone in risk. Because I mean, for a researcher doing work in Cuba, the worst that can happen is that you get deported. So you get into an airplane and goodbye, and you come back to your country and as if nothing happens. But for people who stays in Cuba, the consequences can be really harsh if they are into this kind of projects. And this is really not an anti-Cuba or anti-government project. It just tries to assess what's going on in terms of security and assess. And this is like let me show you so that this is clear. I'm going to share you the screen so that we can start with. I think you can look at it now. Okay, so this is the cover and the back cover of the book, and this is what I was telling you. I wanted to know what's going on in Cuba, because there is this sense that Cuba is a very secure place, and as I will show you, it is to a great degree a secure place, especially as compared to most countries in Central America and many in the Caribbean, and even to Mexico, even to Miami, which is like the neighbors of Cuba. But as I also will go into detail in the presentation, this secure place, it's coexist with massive illegality in almost any domain of the day-to-day life of the Cubans. So that's the kind of things that I want to understand. And also, and this is likely a most important part of the project, Cuba has embarked since I don't know, 2010, 2011, something like that, on a very slow but steady process of economic liberalization. And that economic liberalization process, we know from other experiences and from theory, that may cause some sort of instability and disorder, which will lead to increasing crime, and it will worsen Cuba's security conditions. So in a sense, it was a very attractive project for me, because it was like being like doing research in real time as things are developing in Cuba, as opposed to looking at something that already happened, and you have a lot of information, and you can work with data, with interviews, etc. In this case, things are still unwrapping in Cuba. So in a sense, it was like a live experiment, some like it. And I also think on this project in more general terms, more academic terms, trying to understand, and there's a very strong literature about this, trying to understand what are those circumstances that detonates insecurity in countries that are going through democratization processes, or in general liberalization processes. In the case of Cuba right now, it's economics. Hopefully in the future, it will be politics, right? So I'm going to show you some literature or some findings for Eastern Europe, which is like quite similar case to Cuba in some respects, obviously not identical. And you can see two things. One is how things can go wrong after you democratize in terms of crime. And also it shows you that there is variance. Not all countries went bad, some did, some did not. Let me start with the more abstract and theoretical part of this project. There is, I would say, agreement in the literature in the relationship between these two variables, which are the order conditions and the type of regime. Most authors, and I think Huntington to my taste, is the one that writes better about it. He and others talk about that we will find conditions of order at extremes. If you are a very tough autocracy, let's say North Korea or the Soviet Union with Stalin, you will find order societies. But by order, I mean that, you know, there is certainty about the consequences that follow different actions. So you know that if you do A, you will receive C, for instance. And the similar thing happens in a democracy. Let's think at that extreme in real cases, like Norway, Sweden, and the like. And in the middle, which is the range in which most countries are, especially those in Latin America, which we are part of a democracy, but not quite, and it's an autocracy, but it's really not North Korea, etc. So we're in, and it is in that middle. In Huntington, he talks about the modernization process. Others, like Dahl, for instance, talk about the democratization process, or that path towards the polyarchy. That's where things get a little bit messy and disorder. And among that disorder, there's also the observations from those doing research on democratizations, like Larry Diamond, Juan Lins, that they also observe that security conditions worsen at those moments. Crime rises and the like, and this is quite dangerous for the health of a transition towards democracy. It's quite common, and there's been many cases in Eastern Europe in which after they democratize, or at least they have relatively free and fair elections, people get really disappointed from the new governments. They look at crime, they look at economy, and things are not as they expected with a democracy. So people get nostalgic for autocratic regimes, and that endogenously turns down or makes it much more difficult to transit towards democracy. So it's something that we wouldn't like to observe. This is data, aggregate data, and this is the average for the subset of communist, former communist countries for the period, and non-communist countries in Europe, before, from 1980, and after the fall of the communism in 1991, which was more or less the date for most countries. And you can see how, well, two things. One, homicide rate as a proxy for disorder or for violent crime was always higher at communist countries than in non-communist countries. And that continues to be the case nowadays, even after the fall of the communism. And second, you can see how when things started going wrong, like in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, the homicide rate started increasing steadily, and things stayed like that for, let's say, here's like 6 years at least after the fall of the communism. And to get to the level of homicides that these countries on average had before the fall of the communism, it has to pass like almost 15 years. So it was 15 years with higher rates of homicide. And in many countries, part of the explanation for the comeback, for instance, of communist parties to power was that all the governments were not performing as people were expecting. And this is part of the explanation, right? This is, if we disaggregate this information by country, you can more or less see which are the bad apples here. Albania, Croatia, like in a smaller degree, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Russia, of course. And there were other countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, in which there was not an increase in homicides after the fall of the communism. So this gives us like nice variants to work with and to try to understand what went wrong in some cases and what are the positive things that happened in these countries in which there was not such an increase in insecurity. The existing literature, which is kind of robust for these cases, tell us that sorry, can you see the presentation now? I just want to make sure that you're looking at the PowerPoint and not my face.
Yeah, we've been seeing both the presentation and your face.
Oh, perfect. So look at the presentation, not my face. Okay, perfect. So most of the explanation has to do with many like cultural explanations saying that, well, in these countries, there was already some sort of democratic culture beforehand. Others are more institutionalist and tells, well, countries in which the police work and it was not so repressive as in other countries, things are better and the like. So this gives you like a kind of a good floor to start talking about Cuba, right? So first, I want to talk to you about the first part of the project. It has to do with Cuba's current circumstances. I mean, what's going on in Cuba, given that there's not much data. This is the homicide rate for which we have data. That's the gray line, the gray solid line. That's the homicide rate, which is just the total of homicides divided by the population and then multiply by 100,000. And it allows us to compare it across time and across societies. And the multiplication by 100,000 is just so we don't have like a very complicated number like 0.000 something. You can see how it's been going down, and then the tendency is around 5 and 6 per 100,000 inhabitants. And then this is just the dotted line. The last report from the Cuban government was 5 years ago. The last time I looked at the United Nations data. The dotted lines, black lines is the death rate. These two usually tend to go correlated. So it was just a check. And it's kind of weird that the death rate is going up, but the homicide rate is either steady or going down. Because obviously, one problem with this is whether we should or could believe the Cuban government data. That's always an issue working with these kind of countries that don't have a democratic government or independent organizations that can verify this data. But let's believe this is the Cuba's rate. To put this in perspective and figure out whether 5 is a lot or not, let me compare it, and I'll go back to the other graph. If we put the homicide rate of 5 per 100,000 inhabitants that Cuba has in the region, it is great. I mean, only for 2016 or the latest year reported, only Martinique and Aruba has a smaller homicide rate than Cuba. All other countries are much worse than Cuba. For instance, compare Cuba with El Salvador, with Honduras, with Mexico, with its neighbor Haiti. It's like double in Haiti and the like, right? So for regional standards, it is a secure place if this is our or metric. But we can also think of Cuba, or another way to compare it is with authoritarian regimes, and see how much control the government has over this problem. Here, Cuba does not perform that well. This is all countries that in Freedom House are categorized as non-free. And it goes from Qatar, and the last one is Venezuela. And you can see that many authoritarian countries, they have low homicide rates, as it would be predicted by this inverted U-shaped relationship that I just showed you. Qatar, Bahrain, Brunei, China, they have really, really low homicide rates, right? And then things start increasing, and we get to countries like Somalia, North Korea, Angola, Kazakhstan, Sudan. And this is like the neighborhood of Cuba in the category of non-free countries, right? So it gives you some hint, and I will try to go deeper into that later on. Arguing that the Cuban government is not really a strong government. I mean, it's obviously not China, and it looks much more like these countries, which are kind of more chaotic, like Angola, Sudan, Burundi, Afghanistan, Yemen, right? So here doesn't perform quite well, Cuba. We conducted like a double check, given that there's no good data. So I check in the newspapers the reports that they have for, let me see if I have, okay. The reports on different crimes. This is just accounting from web searches within these news sources: Cyber Cuba, Cubanet, Diario de Cuba, Martín Noticias, and the official ones: Granma, Juventud Rebelde, Radio Habana, Cuba, Telesur. And not surprisingly, like Granma doesn't report any homicide in 2016. I mean, nothing happened, nothing bad happened in Cuba. But I mean, that's what we would expect, right? From official data, official news sources from an authoritarian government. But more surprisingly, at least for me, was that independent media, which is usually based either in Miami or in Madrid, does not report homicides, and some report robbery, some burglary, corruption, but it's really not a topic that these news sources are dealing with. Basically, if you look at the different sections in all of these news sources, there is no like police section, like nota roja. That's when in Spanish, right? I mean, they are so politicized that everything has to do with the regime, with the Castro, with Diaz-Canel, with what happened, and hints that the regime is going to fall, or hints that they are really strong, etc., right? So it's really not an issue in Cuba, and the Cuban government has been really successful at giving this image, which is based on some real data, that nothing really happens in Cuba, right? That things are okay, you can walk at night, and the like. And if you look at, for instance, like Telesur, which is, I don't know if you know it, but it's like the CNN of leftist governments in the Americas. It is, if I recall well, it is funded by Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and I think Ecuador at some point. I'm not so sure. Well, if you look at Telesur, you will see a massive amount of information about crimes, especially homicides, in Mexico and in Colombia. And it reflects on people. When you talk to people, like average people in the streets, and you ask them about, for instance, poverty in Cuba, They will tell you, yeah, well, things are not well in Cuba. You can see things are falling down. Everything is very expensive. We don't find basic things at the store, etc. But people is not killing each other in the middle of the street as they are in Mexico and in Colombia. Those countries really have problems, right? And most people know about it. And I mean, they were telling that to me. I have no way to defend that. I mean, what are you going to say, right? And that's part of the work of the government. Let me go this. Well, this is just some brief context. By any measure that you want to find, Cuba is an autocratic country. It represses political activists and opposition and the like. But it's a very bipolar regime in terms of repression. It's only focused on political repression, and they tolerate most illegal activities in the day-to-day, basically because they know that other way the economy and the people will not survive. So a lot of illicit activities that I found in Cuba are basically determined by the economic distortions of the regime, right? There is a massive amount of illicit markets in Cuba. Almost anything that you want to buy is in the illicit market, but are things that in almost no country would be in the illicit markets. For instance, like beef meat. There was some failed policies in the 80s, well, starting 70s, 80s, in which Cuba tried to create a new kind of cow. It was going to be like a super cow. And it was part of Fidel Castro's idea that Cuba was going to be the Switzerland of America. So they had to have the good cows, right? And I'm not going to go into detail, but they exported cows from the Netherlands and from Switzerland. They made some genetic experiments and matching, etc. And it was a total disaster. The cows, just imagine a cow that comes from Switzerland in the fields in Cuba. Well, I think after 1 or 2 hours, they will drop because it was too hot in Cuba for these cows, and they just erased the local cows, and it was a disaster. So beef is really scarce in Cuba, and it is highly regulated whether you can find Cuba beef. But there's a black market for it. Seafood, the same thing. You will think, well, this is an island. They should have a lot of fish and shrimp and lobster and the like. Well, yes and no. I mean, there is a lot to be fished around Cuba, obviously, but it's very restricted who can have a boat, basically, because otherwise you will be tempted to drive all the way to Florida, and you will escape Cuba, right? So it's very, very restricted who can fish in Cuba, but there is a lot of demand for seafood. So the result is obvious, it's an illicit market, right? There is also a massive black market for electronics, cell phones, tablets, laptops, TVs, and the like. There are smuggled, obviously tolerated or bribed by public officials, clothing as well, and clothing and electronics, they usually come either from Miami, but they also come from Mexico, from Panama, and also from Colombia. Another serious distortion is that I will talk about it when I get to to the reforms, but most jobs are in the hands of the government, and you got to work for the government in almost all areas of the economy. It just opens some like self-employment, like restaurants and stores and the like. But most problematic is that professional services hiring is monopolized by the Cuban government. So if you are a physician, if you are a lawyer, if you're an architect, you can only work for the government, right? With a very small salary. Salaries are usually around $50 a month, which it's absurd. It means like you have like an income tax of around 90-something% of what you are producing. So this creates all sorts of incentives for physicians, for architects, for, well, lawyers is a bit more difficult to engage into this, to offer on the side their services. And all of these that I told you in most countries wouldn't be illegal, for instance, or you have the options to legalize. For instance, like forfeit clothing or smuggled clothing, and you can find it in any country in Latin America, right? You will find it, you can buy it in the street, and you will get your Chanel blouse for $5 and the like. The difference is that in any other country in Latin America, you have the choice to legalize, and you can put a legal store and sell your clothes. I mean, as long as they are legal. I have no problems with the state. In Cuba, you don't have that option. You either sell in the illicit market or you don't sell it at all. Transportation is another illicit activity, and I put unquote illicit, because public transportation is always overcrowded. The public buses, there's usually either there's no gas or there are no parts for proper repair and the like. So people, they just grab their own car and they go through the street and they let people get in, and they have the roads and the like, and they will get paid, but it's illegal, and there's no choice. I mean, there's no way to make it legal. The other great issue that the government has is stealing from the state. At hotels, at restaurants, at tobacco stores and tobacco production, at rum production, rum stores, Cubans are robbing, and they are accomplice with the manager, and the manager with his with the director, and they all get some part of the deal, and so all of this creates very, very dense corruption networks that, I mean, someone would tell, well, it's not so bad to trade beef market in the beef in the illicit market. I mean, it's just food. I mean, nothing bad is going to happen. But you can also trade like sugar, oil, depending on what's scarce in the official stores. Yes and no. I mean, obviously, nothing will happen by selling, or nothing serious will happen by selling sugar in the black market. But we can think of this like a hardware of criminal networks, right? The question is, what will happen once the economy normalizes in Cuba, and you can get all of these things into a legal and proper store? Well, likely you will stop trading this into the illicit market, right? But the question is whether that structure, that criminal structure will continue to operate, now trading with something else. And I will try to show you that it is very likely that this is what will end up happening in Cuba. So the Cuban government, or Cuba, has serious economic problems. They embark in, I mean, for the type of regime that Cuba is, kind of radical economic reforms that allow for self-employment. They are 127, I think, economic activities. None of these are professional services that Cubans can now do. They couldn't do it before. Real estate is now operates sort of like a market, but before it couldn't. I mean, sales were not allowed. You can only do exchanges, and I will exchange you my apartment in Havana by your apartment in Santiago, for instance. Okay. Now I can buy a house in Havana if I have the money to do so. So it created a market that makes that changes completely the incentives in that market. Land tenure also slightly changed. Now you can have more than one property. Now you can, I mean, regarding land, and this related to agriculture, there is more flexibility for you to produce and not have to sell everything to the state. So there are like quotas that you have to give to the state, and then there is an extra in which you can sell on your own, right? So it creates like small markets, but it again it changes incentives for production in agriculture. Imports are allowed now in many areas that were not before. Now there are like quotas. For instance, I think you can get into Cuba one new cell phone, one new TV, and the like. Remittances also change, and this one changed from especially in the coming from the US. It was I don't remember the exact number, but it was like a ridiculous number, like $50 a month or something, and it just like increased like tenfold what Cubans outside the island could send to their relatives or friends or whoever they wanted to. So these economic reforms are giving some oxygen to the really small and struggle Cuban economy. You can see here, if you compare Cuba with other countries in terms of the absolute number of GDP, you can see there is a really small economy. It's just above in the region, just above, well, this is just a sample of countries, but if you look at countries in the region, it's just above Guatemala or Costa Rica, but it's below the Dominican Republic, is much below countries like Colombia, Argentina, or Mexico, right? This is just in the, if we change it to GDP per capita to account for population, it is still next to the Dominica, to Jamaica, below Dominican Republic, and the like. So it's not a very strong economy, and that creates the incentives for the Cuban government to slowly open the economy. The recent events that happened in Cuba, all the protests and the like, were in many cases propelled by bad economic circumstances, which are partially that got even worse because of the COVID crisis and the lack of tourism in the island. And other part has to do with political repression, right? So it's a blend of motives. So last part, so what can go wrong in Cuba? If we remember this graph that I showed you at the beginning, Let's think that Cuba is at point A here in the graph. What we are observing is that Cuba is moving from A to B, which means that according to this very simplified, simple functional form, things are getting worse in Cuba. And you can tell, I mean, you're talking to people, they're telling you, well, there's more robbery, assaults, like, for instance, are getting more violent, and the like. So, and for Cuba to come back to A, which was in the autocratic region, he has to move all the way to Z. So for things to get at least the same in terms of order, many other things have to happen in Cuba. And one of the things that the book alerts is that before things get better in Cuba, they are gonna get much worse, right? In terms of crime, which means homicides, robbery, etc. So this is what we don't want to see in Cuba, right? That this is the vertical line tells you when Cuba democratizes, and then crime explodes. That's what we should prevent Cuba. So what could go wrong? Well, first, Cuba is in an optimal geographic location for drug trafficking organizations. I mean, if you, for some reason, you want to get into the business of getting drugs into the US, going through Mexico is a really bad idea. It's really expensive, it's dangerous, etc., etc. A better route is the Caribbean, right? For many reasons. And somehow it has been, I mean, organizations have been deterred in part because Cuba has been able to stop it. The Cuban government understood that it was a no-no for the US government, anything that has to do with drug trafficking in the Caribbean region. So the Cuban government is actually really strict in this respect. But there is also a lot of pressure from drug trafficking organizations to use that route. And you read reports that they found some package of cocaine or marijuana in the coast of Cuba, and they don't know how it got there. And like, so I would expect that if the Cuban government relaxes this policy, it will be immediately taken by the drug trafficking organizations in the region, which are, well, the most powerful in the world. The other has to do with arms trafficking. And this direction would be from north to south, right? I mean, also, if you are trafficking arms from the US to the south, well, going through Mexico is not really a good idea. You would better go through the Caribbean. And that's another sort of pressure for Cuba. Money laundering, already you can see some indications that a lot of money is being laundered in Cuba. If you look at the press in Miami, there are lots of reports of criminals that they just hide in Cuba. They go to Cuba, and the Cuban government is not gonna turn them into the US. And there's also reports in the press and rumors in Cuba about who owns that restaurant, and it just happened there is some drug dealer from Miami and the like. Given the need that the Cuban government has for foreign currency, the incentives are there for just making as if nothing is happening with that money and getting everything into Cuba. Then there is the question of all these illicit markets that exist, of these which are legal goods and services, and how those illicit markets will evolve once these goods and services are traded legally, right? And one big problem is that the Cuban government, since at least 10 years ago, has been giving more and more part to the military in the economy. So the biggest enterprise of the Cuban government, GAESA, belongs to the army, right? And so they have a direct interest in keeping the status quo and not really opening the economy as such. So there is a clear issue here, because once you start with the economic reforms, and there are very interesting cases, for instance, in Eastern Europe, it's very dangerous to backtrack those reforms, because there's a lot of new interests that are formed, many people is living out of it, and my sense is that the military is not willing to compromise on this. So that's a really problematic source of tension in the case of Cuba. Okay, what do we do? Just to close the presentation. First, we need information. We don't really know what's going on in Cuba, right? I mean, I told you what I learned from the project and the like, but I don't know what's going on right now. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows on it. So there are ways. I mean, this information goes to international organizations like the United Nations. I mean, they can do like some sort of carrot strategy with the Cuban government to get information, because we don't know what's going on in terms of crime. Foreign investment in Cuba must be monitored. Things can go really, really wrong if you allow Cuba to be, again, a paradise for money laundering. And this is more problematic because of the politics that has to do with the United States. How do we properly focus international aid to certain subpopulations in Cuba? There is, and this is like a different project, but there's a lot of discrimination towards, for instance, the Afro-Cuban population. There are a lot of gender abuses also in Cuba. There are certain areas in the rural Cuba that are basically abandoned by the government. So that's something that should be looked at, just so we do not create all these places in which crime can flourish because of need. And a huge problem is how to change the culture of illegality in Cuba. One of the side effects of all these apparently harmless illicit markets is that people is used to live in illegality. They call it necesidad, right? I mean, they justify buying sugar in the black market because they need it, and that makes sense, right? But then the line becomes blurred if you move to other types of goods and services. But in the mind of the people, it is justified because they have such ridiculous and illogic regulation, right? Another important area to look at is the education system. Cuba was a victim of its own success regarding education, and formally educating the Cuban population became an end as opposed to a mean to a better life. So you can, true, they have good education in many areas, less so and less so. But then there are no jobs for you. So what's the point of having such an education system that is totally disconnected with markets, and therefore with getting something useful out of it? And there are some places in which we can start looking, like obviously not the current organizations of the Cuban state, but we have to somehow think about how we reform those institution, businessmen that there are more and more in Cuba, churches, they do a great job, both the evangelical churches and the Catholic churches especially. And there are more and more organizations for subpopulations at risk, and some are already working really well on trying to create like all these, like a more solid floor for a democratic transition in Cuba. And well, that's what I have as presentation. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. So we now end our YouTube broadcast, I believe. Sarah, am I right? Or do we have time for a quick question? Okay. So we might start with a question from our group of people in the seminar room, and then hopefully we'll get some questions from the YouTube transmission. Yes, go ahead. And if you can speak up, so.
Okay. I can also go over
there. Yeah, good. And maybe introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, hello. Thank you so much for presenting today. I'm Nati. I'm really interested in what you were saying about how transportation has become this sort of like illicit activity that people do. And I was wondering if you could expand on that and tell us like how common it is and the different forms of like illicit public transportation people are using, if you know anything about it.
Okay, so I didn't hear the second question. Sorry, could you?
Sorry. Where's the mic?
I can see here.
Okay, so I was saying, I was really interested in the comment that you made about how transportation is kind of an illicit activity now, using like public transportation as kind of like informal ways of getting around. And I'm interested in how common it is to do that sort of thing. And then what does it look like? Like, is it only in sort of like cars, or like, is it like bicycles, or like how do people do that and get around? Because obviously people need to be mobile. So yeah, if you know anything about that, and that would be great to expand upon.
Sure, it's really common, and it's usually people with their own cars, these huge like American cars from the 50s and 40s. And people already know what's the route. They don't advertise, and the cars go kind of slowly, so you can identify, and the driver looks, and so you can identify when it is like a public, it's sort of like a collective cab, let's call it that way. But they only go through specific routes that people know already, right? I mean, I guess because they use it from all the time. The other one are motorcycles. This is less common, and you can jump into the motorcycle, and the guy will drive you wherever you want to go. And there are just like private cabs, but they don't advertise as cabs. Again, it's just usually get these through the doormans or the concierge at the hotels. And you would say, well, I want a private cab. So they call either his brother or his friends or whoever, and they will get something in exchange for it. So it's just like a big network of people that know each other, and they will charge you just the same as a legal cab. But legal cabs are sometimes kind of scarce, and they have to report to the state. So sometimes you want to take this one, and it's a really good business, because I mean, in a matter of hours, they will earn what they will earn in a month in a formal job. So in a formal job, you will get like $50 or so. And these private illicit cabs, they charge like regular prices that you will get in any city in the world. I mean, it's not cheap. The collective cabs, those are really cheap for a tourist, obviously, right?
So Vidal, we are getting a flurry of questions through our YouTube transmission. So I'll try to ask you first one. Hopefully you can tell us very quickly an answer, and then a couple that are more complicated. So
Yes.
one is just a question about the correlation between violence or disorder measured with homicides. So somebody is asking, is it really a good metric to use homicides? Or you could use things like things in health institutions reporting injuries or other kinds of things that, whether homicide rates are really a good proxy of what you are trying to get at.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact correlation, but if you correlated for a big sample of countries, it is really high, the correlation. It should be above 0.6 or something. And plus, for the case of Cuba, you don't have much other data to grab on.
Can I ask another two questions that are related to Mexico in a way? So somebody is asking a very specific thing about, whether these illicit activities that you point out, are they really so different from informal markets in Mexico? Like, informality in Mexico makes up 50% of activity, and nobody seems to care too much about that. And the second one is really related also to Mexico, about whether you think this looks like the one-party regime demise that Mexico had, or the hegemonic party that was kind of, whether the Cuban liberalization is going to be similar to when the PRI loses its elections.
Okay, yeah, on the first one, the big difference is that Cubans have no choice. If you're in Mexico, you have the choice to go legal or illegal, unless you are selling like arms or drugs or something, right? And that creates a quite different relationship to the state. It makes you fully dependent on the state if you don't have the choice to go to the legal market. So that's the first one. And the second one, Alberto, I already forgot, sorry.
Just a question about whether it looks like the hegemonic party demise, like the PRI when it changed, and it actually then went back to power afterwards, no?
Yeah, I mean, it could, but it doesn't seem that's the model that the Cuban elites are going to. They are looking much more to China and Vietnam. That's their dream regime, and they are trying to model the institutions to that. I will think that will be impossible to replicate it because the government is not as strong as the Chinese, and they don't have the same conditions that the Vietnamese have. So I will think that eventually it will, I mean, a best exit would be to look like the PRI and then transition to a more democratic regime, or otherwise things are going to get really, really tense in terms of a democratic transition in Cuba.
So Vidal, before we close the YouTube streaming, one last question on that segment of our conversation. Mikhail Wolf and somebody else also asked a very similar question. Can you tell us more about the impact of the US embargo? Because it seems that that's like the driving force of a lot of this illicit activity. So aren't you kind of downplaying it a bit too much? That the fact is the embargo is there, and it seems to change every Cuban calculation.
Yeah, well, partially the embargo is certainly guilty of this scarcity in Cuba, but there's also the question of the bad economic policies of the Cuban regime. There are things that shouldn't be scarce in Cuba, like sugar, for instance, and they just crash the sugarcane industry. They also crash, as I told you, the beef industry, the fishing, and the like. So yeah, the embargo has something to do with it. But for instance, it doesn't have to do with fishing. It doesn't have to do with beef. It doesn't have to do with sugar. Those are more political or economic decisions based on politics that are crashing the economy. So I would say it's both.
Thank you very much. We have listened to Vidal Romero from ITAM telling us about his latest book, which is the book is available already, which is Security and Illegality in Cuba's Transition to Democracy, Violence in the Hispanic and Lusophone Worlds. I want to remind everyone that next week we meet here again at our class virtual lecture series, and we will have Dr. Sheila Samuelson talking about negotiating alternative narratives of violence in contemporary Mexico. So thank you very much for joining us.